All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this month's webinar on artificial intelligence. We're really excited to have you here. I do want to cover a couple of things before we get started. First of all, we are the NASIG Continuing Education Committee. This is part of our Continuing Education webinar series. And my name is Chris Vitus. I'm part of this committee along with several other hardworking members. And we've been bringing you a lot of good content over the last several years, but we've had a really productive year or two recently. And for that reason, I do want to highlight our CEC webinar archive you can see in that first link that we've provided there. We have lots of exciting webinars in that site that cover a variety of topics. Just a couple of examples. We've talked about serials workflows recently, improving access to Indigenous collections, tips for finding library jobs, and lots of other topics. So we hope you can get into that archive and look at some of the content that we've provided recently. We also have a YouTube channel. You'll see that as your second link on the screen. We encourage you to go there and peruse some of the content that you can find there also. I do want to talk about our next webinar coming up on December 4th at 1 p.m. That is called Dark and Stormy ISSN Secrets with Regina Reynolds. She's the director of the U.S. ISSN Center. There's a registration link for that on your screen. So we'd love to have some of you come back for that webinar as well. One more thing before I turn it over to our speakers today. As you close out of the webinar today, we do encourage you to take a very brief survey to help us understand your impression of the content that's been covered today. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers to introduce their topic and themselves.
One moment, I will. Just 1 second, I will start our slideshow. All right, I think this looks good. Am I good, Jessie?
Yep, looks good.
All righty. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us. I hate to say that we do not have such a great name as a Dark and Stormy Secrets for the ISSN. So this sounds a little dry, but I still hope it'll be useful for you as part of your this continuing education webinar series. Oops. And so my name is Chris Palazzolo. I'm the Director of Collections and Open Strategies over here at the Emory Woodruff Library. And Jessie?
I'm Jessie Copeland. I'm the Director of Resource Services over here at the Woodruff Library.
And I think Jessie's going to get us started. Oops,
Yep.
I'm keep going
too far.
Sorry. There we go.
There we go.
I got a little too happy there. All right.
Well, I'm also going to say that I want to mention that we were assisted in our work on this to develop our policy statement by Susan Kellett, our licensing coordinator, and also John Morgenstern, our copyright librarian. So we can go to the next slide, Chris. Okay, thank you. So I am going to begin. I'm going to turn off my video just for this. I'm going to begin with a little context about AI at Emory University. Like many other universities, AI has become the hot new topic. The university is focused on building our AI research capability and has focused on several areas. The first is the AI Humanity Faculty Initiative. This initiative is focused on more than the technical aspects of AI and includes 4 areas of focus. Those are business and enterprise, human health, law and social justice, and the arts and humanities. And then the Center for Artificial Intelligence and Learning provides services and resources to promote AI literacy, integration, and collaboration. Their focus is on facilitating interdisciplinary research, experiential learning, and community leadership in AI. And these services and resources are open to everyone in our community, empowering individuals to apply AI in their research, work, and daily life. And finally, there is an Office of Information Technology AI Policy Task Force that is working on AI tools, which can be used by our researchers. Currently, Copilot is the only AI tool that we have licensed for the entire Emory community. But again, this course, is focused on tools, not the content that could be used. Next slide, Chris. Thank you. So our work on this new policy began in earnest at the beginning of this regarding counseling transcripts, wanting to use them in a project. And tell me if I cut out because my internet's unstable apparently. And we also began seeing an increasing number of AI prohibitions in new licenses and renewals. So Chris and I realized that we needed to get ahead of this, so to speak, and address these new clauses and determine what our approach and response would be. We looked at our already existing approaches to text and data mining in licenses, which, you know, seem to be very closely related to the use of AI tools. And we also looked, there is already the TDM carve-out as the Library of Congress 1201 exemption, which allows for bypassing some digital locks for text and data mining, along with other uses. So we used our past experiences and requests as a basis for creating this new policy. Next slide, please. So as I said, Chris and I wanted to figure out our stance before this became overwhelming or before we unwittingly agreed to something in a license. We also wanted to be able to respond to requests from faculty and researchers in a timely manner when they requested use of e-content for AI machine learning purposes. To do this, we drafted a policy guideline statement acknowledging the use of e-content with AI as what we believe is transformative fair use. We used the Berkeley guidance as a foundation for our own policy. And as I stated earlier, we also use the TDM carve-out as part of our foundation. And we also, we looked at the Berkeley argument in the notice of inquiry response they submitted to the Copyright Office, specifically their arguments that first, training AI models by using copyright protected inputs falls squarely within what courts have determined to be fair use, and particularly so when that AI training is for nonprofit educational or research purposes. And second, to the extent that the Copyright Office is inclined to create a regulatory right for content creators to opt out of having their works included in AI training, such an opt-out provision should not be extended to any AI training or processes that constitute fair uses. So I'll just say real quickly, somebody asked what's the TDM carve-out, and the TDM carve-out is it's a Library of Congress exemption that where is it? That allows for text and data mining along with some other uses as a fair use.
And just as an add-on, this comes also with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and which recently, just the other day, is actually got expanded and to allow for further TDM rights and to actually facilitate TDM a little more about collaboration, a few other items and so forth. So that's just another place to look as well.
Yeah. So finally, we are monitoring the current environment just to clarify what future rights may be and how changes in the law may affect current contracts. You know, there's always the issue of agreeing to something in a contract that might supersede established law, and so we don't want to do that.
And particularly fair use, as we
fair use. Yeah, we don't want to sign away fair use rights. And the next slide, please, Chris. Okay, so this is a list of some of the background research we did informing our policy statement. And I will say that some of the descriptions I'm going to give you come directly from the policies. So first, we looked at the International Coalition of Library Consortia Statement on AI and Licensing. It was issued March 3rd of this year. I won't read the statement, but it supports ensuring that library users' rights are maintained in alignment with organizational interests and values. Next, there was the Association of Research Libraries Guiding Principles for Artificial Intelligence, and that was issued in, I believe, April of this year. Maybe it was official May 3rd. So ARL intended these principles to be a foundational framework for the ethical and transparent use of AI and reflect the values we hold in research libraries. We also looked at Rachel Sandberg's post regarding UC Berkeley's response to the U.S. Copyright Office, Protect Fair Uses in AI Training for Research and Education. That was October of last year. And we looked at the Authors Alliance posting, licensing research content via agreements that authorize uses of artificial intelligence. That was January of this year. And finally, we also looked at the Spark Open Access post, all TDM and AI rights reserved, fair use, and the evolving publisher copyright statements. And that was March of this year. And I will push it along to Chris to take over for his section.
And I'll make just one note about the last one is if you go to this one, the Spark one, it's interesting because this actually is reflecting statements that were added, or copyright statements of artificial intelligence prohibitions that were added to the bottom of various pages. Elsevier being a good example of one where they added this language kind of hidden towards the bottom of their web pages, particularly when you're trying to access content. And so there were a lot of questions as to whether or not how much they could really, they could enforce that. So I just want to make note of that one. So in our policy, and I would like to let you know that our policy is not exactly ready for prime time as it is written right now, because it does make a few statements about transformative fair use, which we cannot put on the web per se, because that hasn't been tested in the courts, as Jessie was noting, still not settled law. But we want to make mention of what is not covered by this policy. And I think it's always important to define policies by what they're not. And in this case, this is not about any standalone AI research productivity tools, which I'm sure we're all being deluged with right now, things like Side AI, Claude, Perplexity, et cetera. And not about any AI teaching tools, such as those that might interact or be implemented into, let's say, course management software such as Canvas. Those are enterprise level tools, honestly, that should be reviewed by OAIT. And so because of the policy that is being developed by our colleagues in big IT, we want to be a little bit careful about reviewing those, and also for financial reasons as well, because these things are not cheap, as we know. And so really there should be a separate process really suggested for teaching tools. We're thinking that our folks in academic technology services might have a lot to say about the use of AI tools in Canvas, since they manage that service. And so again, this is not covering any of that. It's a separate policy, separate set of parameters and criteria. And this also doesn't cover any AI add-ons to existing e-resources. So as I'm sure we've been all asked to think about a research assistant to Web of Science or a Scopus AI, which often come at a very high cost to academic institutions. And there's a lot of questions in my mind, I'm sure that you have as well, about whether or not you should subscribe to these, particularly when you're already paying for a lot of the content. But putting that aside, this does not cover that. And we also, just as you know, it does not cover any sort of, we're trying to cover things at an enterprise level, for the library, but we're not trying to go in and try and change everybody, meaning that we do expect that there's some small, people are still buying some of these tools for themselves, and we're not trying to really oversee that. But we do know that we call them mini LLMs. You've heard we have some professors who are probably running some of their stuff on their own, models on their own, let's say articles that they're doing searching or downloading. So we're not covering that either in this. We're just trying to provide guidance for the use of the e-resources. So as we mentioned before, a lot of this has been built off a lot of the language already kind of developed by colleagues. And if you don't know Rachel Sandberg already, who's been cited here a number of times from Berkeley, superstar in scholarly communication, as I like to say. But as being a lawyer and a librarian is very helpful in looking at this from a legal perspective, a copyright perspective, but also from a value perspective, meaning that the goal of this kind of language is to ensure that our users can utilize this content for, again, academic purposes, and also to ensure the diversity of kind of the content that is being used to make, to create these new findings and so forth. So this article that I've cited right here talks a little bit about TDM a little bit more, but it's a very valuable article as well from college and research libraries. And so a lot of the elements right here are things that in some ways are already covered by a lot of our licenses. So things like non-commercialization, that's already usually covered. These are requirements that, we're not supposed to create or have our users create, a new competing product, for example, or downloading the entire database and creating their own. We know we have a lot of that language already about downloading excessive amounts of content in our licenses. Also, times we know that there's going to be a certain method of access that the commercial vendor is going to want to use, such as using an API, as opposed to, let's say, a web scraping or a bot, which is obviously almost always excluded in our licenses. And this is something else already from TDM, a controlled environment, and so that creates no recreation of the copyrighted work. So this is kind of a bigger challenge about a controlled environment in terms of restricting oftentimes the usage or the analysis to an environment so that it does not expose any of the copyrighted work already contained in there. So in order for the output from the generative AI in this case is not infringing upon copyright. This is, like I said, a bit of a challenge because these are large data sets, very hard to manage, and quite hard to store. But keeping in mind that these things cannot be in, using an open access, an open AI tool, like that's a third-party tool that's just out there on the web, a third-party tool, which is something we would have restricted anyway. We also would ask that no additional excessive costs. That's something we ask in TDM, that we should be paying twice for content just to be able to use it in a different way. We've already paid for the content. And then we also note about enforcement. So this is kind of a different sort of reasonable accommodation or reasonable effort, meaning that we, as we all know, most of us have in our licenses, that we cannot ensure complete enforcement or complete alignment of our users with every line of our licenses, but we can try and provide as much information in terms of communicating with them through web pages, through individual interactions, to try and provide the restrictions on the content. The main big thing that we have as part of this policy, that the kind of guidelines that we're putting together, is that all these round of requests, just like they were for TDM, need to and should come through the libraries, because every license is different. And even though we're trying to create some overarching consistency amongst the licenses in terms of the language, we need to be sure that the users know that and they come to us, because there are a lot of things to consider. So moving along, that's kind of the bigger structure of the guidelines. And keep in mind, one thing I'll make mention of here as well is that a lot of what our colleagues are pushing is they're trying to push for guidelines and languages that protects the needs or the interest of both the vendors as well as our users. So recognizing that there are legitimate concerns on the part of vendors, publishers, about the copyrighted work under them that they are providing access to, but that there also is a benefit for our researchers to be able to access this content for running large models and discovering new patterns and so forth. So we thought we'd talk about a little bit so far. We haven't done a ton of changes to our licenses so far, but we are beginning to see a lot of those, as Jessie mentioned at the very outset of the presentation. We've been noticing that a lot of publishers are learning as we go along, and there's some less restrictive terms that they started off really strong in terms of like prohibition of complete AI, and now actually are agreeing to some of those arrangements, such as the controlled environment can only be used for non-commercial purposes, needs no third-party tools, et cetera, and so forth. Things that we've already outlined in the guidelines. And an interesting another thing I've been mentioned here is that there's also a lot of them that are putting lines in their licenses now that say things such as these things may change with further legislation and so forth, and we will revisit that, both the vendor and the library, when that comes about. We also, however, with that said, we've also had some outright exclusions, even when all the conditions are met. And those things are a little bit difficult. The APA example that we had earlier was one of those where the researcher actually met all the requirements, but they were not ready to give that access as of yet. And admittedly, that one may have been a little bit different because of possibly the nature of the content there, being that it was counseling transcripts and so forth. We've also been getting to note that aggregators in particular are being a little bit more reticent, particularly those who are data providers. Data is a whole different monster here, and it could do a whole presentation just on the uses of data for an AI. In fact, if any of you are members of the ICPSR, they have some really great presentations recently about this. And our guess is that the reason for that is because of the fact that they are having to provide, or be in line with more contracts with their data providers. In other words, they have multiple contracts on their end that they have to align with or to they have to keep in mind when making these arrangements with libraries. Another good example is HathiTrust. And HathiTrust is, I think, willing to do this, but they have a lot of arrangements with a lot of other, when they did the Google Books and contracts that they signed that do not allow for AI, at least not right now. We've also noticed, of course, as far as a lot of you have noticed, the whole publishers deal making with AI companies. And those are, trying to sell their data off to Wiley, Sage, Taylor, and Francis, and so forth, to kind of get ahead of this. And what that will then look like in the license, how much they're trying to control that access via their own services and via their own arrangements with third parties. Keep in mind, those are oftentimes the commercial side of the house. We've also heard about some folks being a little concerned, authors, about OA and training data, concerns about the restrictions there and how much their work is being used to train models, and also some questions of replication requirements. What can be shared? This is a question we always have with TDM. How much of the corpus can be shared in the goal of reproducibility, right? Moving along. So what do we do, in other words, to kind of inform users and so forth? We have decided to, instead of publishing the policy as it is right now, like I said, a little massaging, we've tried to incorporate some of the considerations or educating some of our users about what they need to consider in terms of when they are considering, I should say, using any of these large e-resources. So to correct this criteria, we have a guide right now for TDM, which we've adapted to include AI, use of AI for e-resources. And so we're trying to adapt it for that page a little bit. And it addresses a lot of the criteria already, and also possible places to get TDM corpora, et cetera, so forth. But it also notes current level of support for accessing and managing TDM and machine learning projects, because that's a huge consideration. We're not really talking about that here. We're talking about a policy. We're not really talking about about how to actually then use that content. And so that's very much a different consideration about how to actually, where do you store it? How do I access it? What tools can I use? Et cetera. So, and of course, there's still the copyright considerations we just mentioned before. we've linked it out here. I'm not going to link out it in this presentation, but you can see that this, this page is very much a dynamic page, but it incorporates a lot of things like the security elements, the controlled environment, the non-commercial use, et cetera, and so forth. Right. So just to go more to specifics, a few of those. So as I mentioned before, there are definitely storage constraints. There are things that we cannot meet right now as a library. We don't have this supercomputer or storage space for all of this content. For those of you who remember the early days of text and data mining, you could buy the hard drives of a lot of the content. And even that was a storage issue because those things were huge in the cases. And then loading them onto machines and all that sort of additional work and additional use. So we're not addressing that in this policy, but we know it's something for folks to think about whenever they're trying to use large amounts of content. Because oftentimes what the vendors will be asking for is what is the security around that storage? Who has access to that content, right? And where is it being held? Will it be destroyed, for example, after you use it, which is a very common line in a lot of our data licenses and so forth. So these are, again, things for us as librarians and our subject librarians in particular, who are really interacting more than some of us in collections and in technical services, to really think about when speaking about a project and what the implications will be. So security I already mentioned to you. One of the things that Jessie mentioned at the very beginning was this OIT policy task force that is currently coming up with policies around tools and so forth. And particularly one of the tools they're looking at, particularly places to securely store the data, securely work with the data. A lot of our vendors, when text and data mining was becoming a really important element of research, particularly the digital humanities, recruiting their own tools such as TDM Studio. There's the Gale Digital Research Lab, I think that's what it's called, yes. Digital Scholar Lab, I'm sorry, DSL. They were controlling security content because they had a product in which only the content, available content to you, the user, or to the library user, was in that tool. A lot of these cases, there is no AI thing, at least there's no walled garden, kind of the old approach, at least not yet that we're seeing. And so therefore, the question oftentimes will be asked by the folks at the vendors will be like, where are you putting this data? And like I said, who has then the access to it? And so the AOA Tech Policy Task Force is looking at tools potentially that may be places where folks can actually then interact with the data and meet the security requirements of the vendors. Keep in mind that most of these vendors are very vague about a lot of the security requirements and specific tools. We're trying to create, they're not saying specifically what level of security and so forth and so on, at least not in the license per se. So there's a little bit of area of maneuver there. We just talked about this whole thing is about the licensing. We're telling folks that we may not be able to license all use that they want. This is something I always want to tell folks is that just because the data is there does not mean that it's obviously easily available for you and downloadable for you, even though you think it should be available to you. And this is not something that's completely new. We've talked to folks all the time about how they can't download tens of thousands of search results from, let's say, Westlaw or Nexus, even though they think that might be a great thing for them to do, or they may need that much content. So that's a really big thing to always remind folks about. We are trying, as things go along, as we work with vendors to try and ensure that we don't sign away these rights for fair use, AI machine learning use for the corpus or for the large amount of content, but we can't assure that. The availability of the data and the cost, this is a huge issue that we always remind folks about as well, because the data it just may not be in a format that you need it in. And plus, it may come at a much larger cost. And again, as we mentioned very early on, we are trying to avoid that. One of our principles for TDM is that we should not be paying exorbitant amounts for additional uses of the content. That should come to us as part of our purchase, particularly if we're buying a perpetual access to it. The other three kind of important things here are about skill support and across the organization. We are all learning about this sort of stuff, right? I will not say that I am by any means even close to being, I would say, meeting complete competency in AI tools, machine learning, LLMs, large language models, and so forth. And not in TDM either. But I think we have to also let folks know that we may have other folks on campus who can do this. We have a department here on campus, a unit, I'm sorry, of the Libraries and Museum called Emory Center for Digital Scholarship. And that is a great place that actually supports text analysis, network analysis, other types of tools, Python, training and coding and so forth, working with the data and so forth. So again, we're trying to provide the ability to use the data. Sometimes the skills and support have to come kind of out from that. We're not, what's a good word? We're not guaranteeing that access. We've mentioned training and privacy. We always want to remind folks that even if they're using a third-party tool, let's just say for their own stuff, and they're asking, they're putting in three PDFs of something or so forth, or they're putting in an Excel table they created. Keep in mind that these tools, oftentimes, that data may become, again, part of the training data. Now, if you're doing it in Copilot, like we have locally here, a lot of schools have Microsoft products, the Microsoft Suite have added Copilot. They're in your license for Copilot. That will hopefully prevent that from happening. Although I've heard of it a few times when actually that the training that just not destruction, but the non-use of the training model or the non-inclusionist training data, excuse me, has not been as seamless. But putting that aside for now, there's also a lot of issues about privacy and so forth, whether or not that content, being used to train models and so forth. It's just something that be sure people know, even when using AI tools that have nothing to do with e-license, e-resources, and other library licenses. And we always remind folks of the web scraping and bots. Web scraping is a popular thing we know about in using, in particular on public websites and so forth. We always want to try to remind folks, however, that even though it's probably on the web, it still may not be particularly usable. And what I mean by that in terms of copyright, it may not be the legal requirements for uses or may not be met just because it's out there. Even though this is not specific or unique to AI tools and so forth, this is very unique to TDM as well as to just get even before any of that, people are trying to pull down tables from different websites and so forth. We want to remind for data collection and so forth, we always want to remind folks that this is something you want to be aware of. So in other words, all this AI talk has given us the opportunity to kind of reinforce some of these elements of using big data and large data sets in general, coming from our e-resources and elsewhere. So kind of the next steps, which I've kind of already got to a little bit here. One of the things we want to do is, and Susan Kellett, who was mentioned earlier, is our licensing coordinator for the libraries. And she has a very developed and a very explicit set of licensing terms to review, particularly for newer contracts, for anything that is requested by our subject librarians. And the goal here is to incorporate some of the basic language to document some of the AI tools that may, or AI rule allowances that may be available in the license. It's not, we're not making it a deal breaker per se in our licenses, but we are wanting to document it so that we can go back to, and again, for user education purposes, to refer back to licenses and make those available to folks to take a look at, but also to distill it to say this is allowed for this particular database for AI, and which is what you can, and cannot do and under what conditions and so forth. So we can always go back when we get a request and so forth. And so documentation. As Jessie also mentioned at the very beginning, we're going to update this as necessary. This is not settled law. It has not been decided that this is transformative fair use. This is an argument being made by scholars. And we know that a case may be brought, and there are cases right now, particularly for a lot of the OpenAI, like the New York Times against OpenAI, for example. So decisions and cases may come about that may change this landscape completely. I will say at this point that the European Union is much further ahead than we are in a lot of this. They do not really allow for opt-outs, for example, or the use of authors' content unless it's for commercial. But if it's for non-commercial use, that rule is written in. And so they are a little bit further on in terms of text and data mining and AI machine learning than we are, being that the US is, particularly the environment that we're in terms of business interests and vendor interests and so forth, I think it's going to be a much more difficult area to navigate. There'll be maybe some challenges to that. And we're just going to have to keep up with the regulations that come around. We're also going to socialize this with Emory researchers, as we mentioned already, some of how we've adapted our TDM web guide to have a little bit more of an AI focus, or adding that on or adapting it. But we have a group called Data Science Community Practice locally that has a lot of folks from across the libraries, from our Health Sciences Library, from our Woodruff Library here, who are experts in data sets and data research, data management, and other aspects of data. And so they're a great place to get a little bit of feedback from, but also just to make them aware. We're going to commence a process for vetting the AI add-on tools, as we mentioned before. I'll leave that aside. That's probably a separate presentation at some other point in time. And I'd be we'd be very welcome to hearing other folks' approach to that. Particularly, we're already strapped for money, most of us, trying to find a way to do that. And that I put a little link there for one thing I found in terms of criteria that some folks are using when they're looking at different AI tools that are more kind of what we call more productivity tools. And as I mentioned before, we are just reviewing this in line to merge the AI university policy on open access to be sure we're in line with that, and so forth, and make sure that when we educate users, we also tell them or educate them about some of these other tools that may help them use or may help them navigate or facilitate their analysis and so forth, especially as it relates to secure data environments. All right. And I think we just put a few other extra useful links. Some of these are repeats from the initial slide. But one of the ones that recently came out that I thought might be of uses that I found interesting was this tracking the licensing of scholarly content to LLMs. And this kind of is a tracker that Ithaca makes reference to a tracking mechanism that Ithaca has put in place to look at different arrangements and agreements that different major vendors have put into place, which has not gone without some controversy, of course, from authors for training data. But again, that's focused a lot on the commercial environment as opposed to the internal environment. But what we're thinking about is whether or not that's then going to influence what they're willing to do, the vendor that is willing to allow for in our licenses when they kind of want to monetize it for themselves, and they have all this content to do that with. So that's a lot, I know, and it's a lot to think about and so forth. And so again, I think the final thing I'd like to say before we open it up and respond to some questions is that this, I think, in a lot of ways reinforces the need for researchers to work with the library and work with folks, because there's a lot of expectations around researchers and the possibilities that AI machine learning opens up for their research, particularly in the digital humanities, although not exclusively. And then also that we're all learning about all this as we move along, and that there will probably be more presentations in the future, not particularly from us, but from others who may have taken a bit of a different approach to this. So it's best to kind of stay up on this knowledge and to just continue to attend webinars such as this one to try and stay ahead of the game as much as possible, even though it seems like this is moving much faster than any of us. So I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you very much. And Jessie and I are more than happy to take on any questions that have been.
Well, there are a lot of questions.
Oh, goodness. Okay.
So, and the easiest one, we can start with the easiest one. Can you put in the link for the information today article in the chat?
From the what? The icon?
The article you mentioned in a couple slides.
Oh, within the presentation slides, and we'll put and I will pull it out. Hold on.
Okay.
I'm going to stop sharing. Let me stop sharing, and then I'll do that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the first question, it's we have two questions in Q&A, so I'll start with those because those were the first one received. I am wondering about AI embedded in common tools like Adobe, Microsoft Office, Google Drive. Has there been any questions as to how this can be used if they come into contact with vendor content? How does this come into play with the license?
Let me think about that for a second.
So I will say that with the licensing, typically the what we've seen are vendors are tool agnostic, so to speak. It's not so much what tool you're using, but what you're doing with the content. So that's one thing. You know, because if somebody, you know, if somebody's, you know, downloading a bunch of stuff and then putting it through, you know, Copilot or whatever other tool it is, it's more about the use of the content than the tool.
So it's an interesting question about how to protect the library, you know, from third-party misbehaviors that are out there. That, and I think at some point we have to make some like reasonable efforts on our part, but I think we also want to ensure that the license is very clear about what efforts we will take, or you know, to do what to make those protections, right? But I don't know if we can constantly, you know, think about every particular possible you know, misbehavior or possible, the word, or possible infringement that might come out from the use. I don't know, honestly. That's a good question.
And people, we all deal with faculty and researchers. They're faculty and researchers. They're not, they don't exactly think about these things before they do it. But also, you know, in our licenses, we generally don't agree to terms that would hold us liable for, you know, other people's misbehavior. Like, or in cases, you know, you've seen the license language where it says, if you cancel, you're going to make all your users delete anything they've ever downloaded. And it's like, no, we're not going to agree to that, you know, so.
I mean, we can tell folks that this is what their license says and that they
Yeah.
should do this, but I don't think
Yeah.
there's any way to enforce that. So I'm also thinking of my, as one additional item to that as well. It reminds me a lot of using learning management systems where we tell folks all the time to be sure you link to an article, right? As opposed to putting the PDF there as well. We try and monitor that as much as possible. Our reserve staff try to do that as much as possible. But you're going to find that user who doesn't do that. And we know that can get libraries into universities into trouble. So we try to make sure that they know that as well. And I don't mind, Sophia, just kind of going through some of these if you want me to as well.
Yeah.
I mean, just as I read them here. But I think Jessie and I both see them too. Or do you want to?
Yeah. So do we want to go on to the next question in the Q&A?
Yeah, there is next, so yes.
We'll see how many we can do here. So the second question here is that about current case law. I don't know of current case law right now. We're trying to follow that a little bit from the Authors Alliance, from Dave Hansen and a few others. We have a very well-known scholar here who's part of the AI Humanity group called Matthew Sag, and he is a big expert on copyright and AI and reuse of content and fair use and all those sort of interrelated concepts. And so we're kind of hoping that he keeps up with some of these for us, and then he will give us some of that. But I don't know of anything that's out there. Just that's
I think you skipped to the second question in the comments, not the Q&A. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So the second one in the Q&A was: do the vendors revisit your licenses when the law is enacted or when your contract is up? The law always trails technology updates.
Good point.
And
So
I would
the
say that,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, it's generally when contracts are up, when we get the renewal licenses, when we get something new or anything like that. I think we did have one issue. I think somebody did try to change something at one point mid-year, but I'm not quite sure. I might be
Yeah, if
misremembering
one did, the
something.
Economist did.
Yes,
I'll be
that's
honest,
right.
and say that one. And so we pushed back on that because one of our other rules was that we don't want to renegotiate an AI tool at the time of contract renewal.
Yeah,
Because we don't want to have to sign an addendum at that point. We want to think of the license as a whole.
yeah.
So that was one thing that we pushed back on, and actually we're successful on that, to push back on that.
Mhm.
To say, they said, okay, fine. I'll do that.
So that's the two in Q&A. And so then in the comments, one question was, do you see a cause for concern if for libraries, if one library product or service accidentally or deliberately scrapes data off of a competing product? I don't think I've ever heard of that happening, but I guess it could. What type, if any, protective clauses should be included to protect the library from third-party misbehaviors? Example, a research assistant tool examines the articles from a different provider who may have an exclusionary clause within their licenses for library usage of AI.
A good question. I don't have a good answer for that right now.
Yeah, I mean,
Bob,
you can extrapolate from other things. We've had issues with people using, the citation management tools that sometimes there's a setting somewhere in the background of it where once you put in a article, it will then start automatically just constantly checking to see if there are any updates to that article. And so it looks like, 1,000 downloads and it's coming from your IP. So I would say it's probably similar to that, because then, we have to tell the researcher or the faculty member, sometimes the student, how to go in and turn off that setting. So. And third-party misbehaviors, I mean, generally speaking, we wouldn't agree to any kind of license that would hold us accountable for somebody else's misbehaviors. I mean, not to say that they can't file suit, but yeah. Chris?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think
You
covered
looked like
it.
you were contemplating, and I thought,
I was
well,
contemplating, but
let
I
me
think you
yeah.
covered it. I think that.
The next up is from Christina, is what licensing language have you used or tried with vendors with multiple underlying licenses for their content, and using those content licenses to limit TDM and AI?
We are, I think right now we are haven't provided them with the language as of yet. We first asked them, is there any room for negotiation, number one, on those sort of things. And number two, then honestly, I have provided them with the language. There's the Google Doc that Rachel Sandberg has put together that has gotten a lot of traction, that addresses many of the vendor concerns, and see whether or not they'll take that at face value. And we have not had a chance yet to really do. Honestly, The Economist was pretty picky about this one. They did not go for that. But we do have a license coming up as a renewal that I would like to try this method on. And so we're going to have our licensing coordinator, Susan, in this case, try it out and see whether or not. But the first case is whether or not there's any room for maneuver. And sometimes there is, sometimes there's just not. And I think you have to pick your battles here a little too on some of the cases as to whether or not, and look at the use case scenarios and whether or not it's going to be really a valuable service for the AI, machine learning for that particular tool. Do we have actually someone who might, this is where subject librarians come in helpful, because sometimes they might know if there's an underlying project.
There is a related question in Q&A. Have you declined to pursue any resources due to AI restrictions?
Not as of yet, no, because it's for us that sometimes the tool is so important that I just can't. in good conscience think that, you know, the amount of use that we need from that content for non-AI use way outweighs the actual need for the AI and machine learning. And that's something that at that time we may readdress on a single basis. And one thing I also want to make mention of here is that nothing, honestly, you know, is we prefer to be negotiating licenses, of course, but sometimes some of these folks, these vendors, will negotiate a very specific license for a specific set of data, for a specific amount, only for that one user. And as much as I don't like to have that happen, have all these multiple licenses running around, I know Jessie feels the same way. It's sometimes the only option in some cases. If we can't get rights for the entire Emory community, right? And if they're willing to pay a certain amount of money, this researcher, and have the money to pay for it, then so be it too. So, but we'll start the process and see where we take that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So back to comments, this is kind of similar. Have you had any success negotiating with content providers that initially do not allow generative AI uses?
We're doing a test case this fall of that right now. I won't know who it is right now, but there's one this case where we're going to see whether or not we can get met, because the original was extremely prohibitive when we signed the license, and we needed the content so badly, or the renewal was happening so quickly that we overlooked it. To be absolutely honest with you, because they'll sometimes throw it in without you having if you don't look at it a fine-tooth comb. But now that we have something to refer them back to, and also how their peers are referring to some of this content, I always say if Elsevier can be a little bit more accommodating, certainly you can be. It's my new rule that I have.
We had a few people asking if you will be willing to share sample language or your internal checklist or any of those things that you have mentioned you developed.
Well, the Google Doc, I will say, is easily, I'm looking it up right now, so just give me a moment. The doc that we're talking about that Rachel Sandberg put together for some of the language that we have used as a place to start is publicly available. I'm looking up the actual the link for it for folks. Just give me one moment and I will put that in. And actually, I will say this, the better place to do this is actually the Authors Alliance post that we made reference to actually includes a link to that language too from her in there. I'll put that one in the chat in just a moment.
And the next question is more of a question, I guess it sounds like for anybody, but we are enjoying the services of CCC and their newly launched AI rights, but unfortunately those rights only allow the output to be used internally. Has anyone had any luck negotiating for external use in research of those rights with journals that are covered under the CCC AI rights?
So is the CC license a kind of a blanket license for that kind of content? Is that what I understand?
I think so.
For a specific journal content, they have negotiated on behalf of the vendors and then offer that license to libraries. And I bet you some of the reasons that it's for internal use is because they've had to make that as a concession to the individual publishers, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
That's my guess.
Yeah. And then finally, the last one from Sylvie is curious to hear your thoughts regarding GDELT and copyright compliance behind it. I was just looking that up. I'm assuming you're referring to the GDELT project, which is what's the acronym? Wait a minute. Well, now I can't find the acronym.
Are you talking specifically about that global database?
The global database of events, language, and tone.
Being that that's a database, like that's an interesting, being that it's a kind of a free tool and so forth. I actually had some some students who are interested in this. I don't know.
I don't know, because
about
it
that.
depends, because it looks like they're collecting some news about things, and I guess it depends on how they're providing links. It's kind of like the course reserves. Are they providing links to the possible news articles or blog posts, or are they actually like wholesale copying them and posting them for free? I mean, that would be a blatant copyright violation. So I guess it depends on that. So.
Yeah, and also it depends on how, like, they're serving out the data also. So, you know, the data set itself that they're creating, which has trillions of data points.
Yeah.
Sure, because the way it's the algorithms that are pulling this content about different events and so forth. I don't know. And like I said, that one thing I'm not as familiar with is, and I'm learning a lot about is the data element in terms of using data like tabular data and code books and other things like that for AI machine learning. There are some restrictions that are being worked out, or that are being, not good restrictions, but issues that are being negotiated and considered by some of our colleagues in data in data services land.
So I'm sorry, I'm trying to go through all the questions because there are a lot of questions, but I do like this one from Susan Davis. Have you or anyone tried to use an AI assistant to review license agreements? And I'm sure somebody has. I know Susan's on here, Susan Kellett, our licensing coordinator, and I don't know if Susan's tried that, but I have not. And but I'm sure somebody out there, some licensing person has tried that just to test it. I mean, I think in that case, you know, you get into some privacy issues of, you know, is it a closed system? Is it an open? Because obviously sometimes there are terms about whether or not our license is public or private and things like that. So that would be
I've heard some folks
would be
potentially
fun to
using
try.
license reviews, looking for commonalities and licenses and so forth. And
I'm sure somebody has, you know, to say, you know, look for these terms, you know, interlibrary loan, course reserves, just to at least, you know, find the things. So
yeah, it's just interesting things there. I will say that also to look up that docs language. I'm gonna send Sophia, can you send something to all the webinar participants afterwards who've registered? Is that possible?
Yes, absolutely. It is possible.
Okay, so I'm
yes.
gonna send a couple. I'm gonna maybe cut and paste those links from our presentation, and send those out since we're gonna share the presentation eventually anyway. I'll do that. Is that cool?
Yes.
That might be easier than me trying to find all the links.
yeah,
Is what I'm trying to say. And one thing I just like to make note of that, you know, a lot of folks have looked for, you know, had kind of to finish up on maybe is a lot of folks have been asking, you know, for other language or accepted language and so forth. And the reason why I learned about some of these is just from asking colleagues, and to a certain extent, and why I think non-disclosure agreements are so important, because then you can start seeing, because for example, the Elsevier content, the Elsevier language that talks about, you know, considering future legislation and revisiting the language at that point in time is actually from an Elsevier license from a colleague of ours at NC State, I want to say, is how we learned about it from there as well. So non-disclosure agreements are really important for that particular reason, even more now, I would argue. So although, you know, state schools obviously can push on that a little bit more than sometimes we can on our, one of the non-benefits of being the private. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. And we'll share some of the links out that Sophia will send out to the participants after this. If that's good with you, Jessie, to do. I think I'll make it faster to do that.
All right. Well, it is just about 3 o'clock, and we do want to thank everybody again for attending. Just a reminder that you should see an evaluation survey when you close out of this webinar. We have a link there for it as well, and we hope that you can spend just a minute taking that survey for us. A reminder that we'd love for you to check out all of our archived webinars. You can find that at our archive or at the YouTube channel. And one final reminder of the upcoming webinar on December 4th, Dark and Stormy ISN Secrets. And we have other exciting webinars coming as well. So we hope you can join us in the future. Thanks again, everybody, for attending, and we'll hope to see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
thank you.
Thank you.